Okay, hello everyone. Apologies for being out, but we're just going to go over a introductory lecture to something called the Progressive Era, and then the rest of the week you guys are going to be working on a project. So you're just going to want to fill in your notes as we go along. Here we go. Okay, so we all remember that famous Jay-Z song, I got 99 problems but ain't one? Well, the progressives, a group of people dedicated to fixing society, would say, I got 99 problems but too much government ain't one. More on that in a bit. Okay, so we just finished talking about the Industrial Era, the Industrial Revolution. Another name for that period is called the Gilded Age. Gilded. Now, those of you who are familiar with metalworking might know this, but if you gild a piece of jewelry, all you're really doing is taking a crap piece of metal and putting a coating of gold or silver on it. So remember this. Someday, ladies, when someone gets down on their knee and asks you to marry them, you better inspect that ring to make sure that it's not gilded. So this is kind of a metaphor for the industrial era. If something is gilded, right? It could be a rotten piece of metal, could be rusted and corroded, but it's got this like thin layer of like 18 karat gold, let's say, on the outside. But it's thin. So on the outside it looks really good, but underneath it all, it's crap. There's junk. There's problems. And so that is kind of a metaphor for the industrial era. And the progressives are going to be the group responsible not only for pointing out these problems, but for working to correct them. So let's start in the last decade of the 1800s. In the 1890s, a political revolution known as populism swept America. Now, populism is pretty common in American history. Donald Trump is definitely a populist candidate, running against the system, running against the establishment, running against the swamp, as he calls it in Washington. So what happened in the 1890s is a group of rural farmers and urban industrial workers were very upset with the changes that industrialization had brought to their society. And they believed that this policy of laissez-faire, where the government stays out or sides with business, had led to economic and political corruption. And so, what do? They are going to get involved politically and they're going to propose a change. So the populists, they want to end the power of monopolies by having the government actually take over the railroads, own and operate the railroads. So there would be no private company that owns the railroads. That's actually socialism. They wanted to create a graduated income tax to tax the fortunes of the rich at a greater percentage than everybody else. So, people like Rockefeller and Carnegie would pay more in taxes than, let's say, the people working in their refinery or in their steel mill. They wanted to end the ability of big business to influence elected officials by giving the people more opportunities to vote on issues. So they thought that government had become corrupt, that big business or special interest had too much power, and that more power needed to go back to the people. And they also wanted to weaken the grip of Wall Street on the economy by getting the government to coin more gold and silver, which would flood the economy with money and raise wages for working people. So really, in this one, all they're really calling for is they would think the government is kind of working alongside with what's good for Wall Street, but not what's good for Main Street. So they wanted to cause inflation, which is actually going to help the working people in this case. So in 1896, the populist movement kind of peaks. It reaches its high point. And they nominate a candidate for president, but he loses to a laissez-faire, pro-business Republican named William McKinley. So the populist revolution kind of flames out. But what we can say is they lit the torch, and the torch is going to be passed on to a new group. And that new group will be the progressives. Okay, in 1901, after winning a second term in office, William McKinley is assassinated right here in Buffalo by an anarchist named Leo. I can't even pronounce his last name. It's very Eastern European. While he takes a bullet in his abdomen, he doesn't die right away, and he actually hangs on for a couple of weeks. Teddy Roosevelt, his vice president, is out hiking in the Adirondacks, and somebody actually has to go find him and tell him that the president has been shot. So Teddy Roosevelt, upon McKinley's death after a few weeks, will be sworn in as president right here in Buffalo. And Teddy Roosevelt is so different than any other person who came before him. He is a completely different type of Republican than McKinley. He is a fascinating guy. You read a book on him. I mean, I know you don't like to read, but read a book on McKinley. I'm sorry, on Roosevelt. It's a fascinating life. He believes that the problems created by industrialization need to be corrected by the federal government. So the Republican Party is about to go in a completely different direction. And it's going to move the pendulum that we talked about away from laissez-faire capitalism and towards regulated capitalism. Now, Roosevelt, when he becomes president, is very, very motivated by what he reads in the newspapers, the books he reads, and there's a group of people called muckrakers. Muckrakers. So they rake the muck. Think of the muck as covering up a significant problem. Right? And then muckrakers are journalists who expose corruption and abuses in society. In other words, they're investigative reporters. That's all they are, investigative reporters. Now, the most famous of them is Upton Sinclair, who wrote a famous book called The Jungle. Now, in your packet, you have a copy of The Jungle. And at the end of this lecture, you really need to read it. And there are 2 questions at the bottom. It is an incredibly powerful passage about the meat industry and some of the abuses and corruption that Upton Sinclair exposed in the meat industry. It will make your stomach a little queasy. Okay, so what is a progressive? We've been talking about Teddy Roosevelt as a progressive. All right, a progressive thinks that government should take an active role in correcting problems by passing laws, right? And that's different from somebody who believes in laissez-faire capitalism. They say that government should not interfere with social or economic issues. Progressive reforms are going to move the nation toward greater government involvement in the economy. So like we said, it's going to be not laissez-faire capitalism, but regulated capitalism, or what we could call a mixed economy, where there's some government involvement in a capitalist economy. So the progressives and the populists, let's not forget about them, authored this idea that the government has a responsibility to ensure the social and economic well-being of its citizens, and that they can improve the condition of its citizens. So let's take an issue to make this seem real. Let's take poverty, right? People living in absolute poor conditions. A social Darwinist would say nothing can be done because those people who live in poverty do not have the talents or the skills necessary for success. If they were smart, if they were hardworking, if they were capable, obviously they wouldn't be living in poverty. A progressive would say, well, it's a lot more complicated than that. Let's look at what caused those people to fall into poverty. All right, maybe they had, as children, they were forced to labor. So they didn't have an opportunity to gain an education because they were too busy working in a factory at a young age when they should have been in school. So how do we fix that? We pass a law banning child labor. Tenements. Living in tenements, which are overcrowded, unsanitary, unventilated, dark apartments. If you live in a place like that, where you don't have access to fresh air, you don't have access to proper ventilation, you don't have access to running water and proper sewage, and it's overcrowded, well, of course you're going to get sick, and then you can't work if you're constantly sick. So maybe that's a reason why people are in poverty. So what do the progressives do? Pass a law to regulate housing and make sure that it's safe and sanitary. Alcohol abuse. Maybe somebody had abused alcohol because they were trying to escape the pain of working 20 hours in a factory, but their alcoholism ends up causing them to be unable to work or save money as well. So how do we do that? Let's pass a law to ban alcohol. You're going to notice the pattern here. The progressives love laws. Low wages. So there's no chance to move up economically if you're constantly seeing your wages kind of held steady or they don't rise. So let's pass a law to either give unions more power, or maybe we pass a minimum wage law. All right. So in closing, this is the difference. Progressives believe in government. They believe that government should get involved to fix problems. Right. So in the next couple days, you're going to be working on a project where you're going to look at as a group, one problem in particular, and how the progressives sought to fix it. So more on that tomorrow. If you're all done, you should turn in your yellow notes on the Industrial Revolution. All right. I'll see you guys after February break. Good night and good luck.